Well, good evening, everybody, and thanks for coming. What a great turnout this is. My name is David Jolliff, and I am honored to be the chair of the Tippy McMichael Lectureship Series Planning Committee. And could I ask the other members of the committee simply to stand up so we can say thank you very much. All committee members, please stand up. Thank you very much for all you've done. Thank you. Thank you. We put together the reception ourselves, and I always say I'm always nervous about these things. When you give a party, you wonder, is anybody going to show up? Or is anyone going to eat when they come? Well, thank heavens you both showed up and you ate, which makes me very happy, which is great. I hope you had the opportunity to take a look at the blurb in the program about Clifton Tipping McMichael. It is she who has made possible what we do here tonight. Many of you do know that there's a line that circulates around Fayetteville with some regularity, and that line is, I don't go to church, but if I did go to church, I'd go to St. Paul's. And one of the reasons that people want to do that is that we really try our very best to walk the walk here, to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, give shelter to the homeless, and visit the prisoners. And we do that largely because Tippy McMichael years ago was thought of us in her will and left us a substantial endowment that we're able to do not only this lectureship series, but also other wonderful outreach work that happens here at St. Paul's. So pay attention, and as our former rector used to say, remember us in your will, if you can. And I want to just call your attention to the back of tonight's program, let you know about the wonderful programs we have coming along down the line. You see October 8th and 9th, we'll have the Reverend Nuria Love Parrish, who is from Michigan. She is the founder and the chief operating officer for something called Plainsong Farms. And Plainsong Farms is a center for ecological education and Christian discipleship. She really does take the idea of feeding the hungry very seriously. And she'll be with us in October, sort of a long-awaited visit. We've been trying to get her to come for some time, and we're delighted she's coming. And then in February, and actually March of 2023, because that'll be here before we know it, we will have the Reverend Will Gaffney here, whom many of you are reading during the Adult Forum here on Sunday mornings. There's a series looking at her sermons. She is an Episcopal priest, but she's also a professor of the Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School, and her most famous book is called The Womanist Midrash. It's a reintroduction to the women of the Torah and the throne. So she'll be coming to us with all sorts of interesting ideas and insights from her work about the women in what we call the Old Testament, and we're delighted to have those folks joining us at that time. We are already scheduling some folks for fall of 2023, so keep your ear to the ground. We always try to have great folks in. If any of you have thoughts about who you think would be a great Tippy McMichael speaker, let me know. I'm here at St. Paul's pretty much every Sunday morning. Let me know. I'd be glad to hear your ideas, because we want to continue to bring in people who will really fulfill us in many ways as they do. I'm now going to turn it over to our rector, Evan Garner, who's going to be a ventriloquist of sorts and introduce our speaker.
Thanks, David. That's exactly right. Before I put on my ventriloquist act, I wanted to say one extra thing about tonight's presentation. Often, our Tippy speakers come back and speak to us on Sunday morning, but Elliott is a one-night-only event, so enjoy it. You're in the right place. But tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we will be hearing one of Dr. Will Gaffney's sermons and talking about her sermon. So in anticipation of her visit, there is a Tippy-themed adult forum tomorrow at 10 o'clock, and of course, you're most welcome to be there. I have been asked to read an introduction. Carol Sue Wooten, who is a member of our Tippy McMichael committee, who is also one of Elliott's students recently. It was her idea to invite Elliott to be here, but she's got a little bit of a tickle in her throat, and she is worried that she might cough her way through this. So let me read what she has written in introduction. Where does the West begin? What would you say? Is the American frontier and the American West, are they the same thing, or is there a difference? Historian Richard White refers to Elliott West as, quote, the best historian of the American West. We are in for a treat. Elliott grew up in a family of journalists. His father was editor of the Dallas Morning News, the second largest newspaper in Texas, and his brother was a travel writer. Elliott holds a BA from the University of Texas and a PhD from the University of Colorado. Since 1979, he has been here in Fayetteville and as a distinguished professor of history in the Fulbright College at the university. But in December of last year, he retired from teaching, though you can tell he is still speaking and writing. Carol Sue notes that about 2 years ago, I was visiting Jeannie Wayne, telling her that I was taking a history course, during a semester at the U of A as a senior Razorback. Well, Jeannie said, take one of Elliott West's classes before he retires. And Carol Sue says, thank you, Jeannie. Elliott has been recognized twice as the university's Teacher of the Year, and in 2009 was one of 3 finalists for the Cherry Award for the Outstanding Classroom Teacher in the nation. Dr. West has great command and exhaustive knowledge of the American West, and he combines that with his unique and talented ability to share that with his students in a way that shows them great respect and gives them the benefit of their own intelligence. In other words, he does not talk down to his students, instead is a great storyteller. You might know that Elliott has published 10 books, many of which are award-winning. He is in demand as a consultant and speaker, and we have him right here in our midst. And his most distinguished honor is that he is the husband of our beloved Associate Rector, Suzanne Stoner. Thank you, Carol Sue, for those words. Join me in welcoming Elliott West. Elliott.
Well, can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Where's Dan? Up now? Keep talking. Well, I'm used to that. It's a...
It's on, but it's kind of off to the side. May
Okay.
I offer, are you going to wear these?
No.
Okay, great. May I put them here?
Go ahead.
Try that.
How's that? Is it better? Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, David. Thank you, Carol Sue, for that wonderful and very kind set of remarks. Thank all of you for coming. I was on the first Tippy committee ever when the series first began, so I have a great affection for the and kind of a loyalty to the series, so I'm very honored here, of course, to be asked. When David asked me if I would speak, I said, sure, I'd love to. About what? And he said, whatever you want. I said, boy, that's a really dangerous thing to say. But I thought, this is St. Paul's, so I probably ought to talk about, religion. So that's what I will do. The problem with that is, I thought, well, I should do that. But then on the other hand, the problem is I'm not an historian of religion by any remote stretch of the definition. I do cowboys and Indians. I do history of the American West, especially the 19th century, and the history of American Indian peoples. So I do Western and Indian history. So I thought, well, I could talk about Native American religion. That's another problem. Yogi Berra would say that opens up a whole box of Pandoras. Beginning with the fact that, as I tell my class in the first 5 minutes, as far as I know, I have no Native American heritage. I've said that for years. Well, back in the fall, I took one of those 23andMe things, You know what those are? You spit in this plastic tube and you put it in the mail, and then 3 weeks later you get this note saying you're a Romanian or something. It came back, so it's official. I have not a single molecule of Native American genetics, as far as I can tell. Furthermore, of course, to state the obvious, I'm an Episcopalian Christian. I am not a practitioner of any Native religion. I never have been. I have no insights from it. So, speaking about Native American religion, I have absolutely no credibility as either a Native American or a practitioner of the religion. So, thank you for coming. The bar is still open. But, of course, there is an historical record, and I have made some attempt to study that, so I can say something about it as an outsider. Please keep that in mind. As an outsider about this general topic, fascinating topic of Indian religion. And I encourage you, if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to seek out the views of this topic from the point of view of Native peoples themselves and for practitioners of those religions. You get a very different take on it. And in that, I'll use that as the occasion to thank the Osage people and later the Cherokee people for whom this is their homeland. Okay, so then the question was, what topic? What specific topic? I thought, well, it has to be two things. It has to be something that a lot of people have heard of, at least vaguely. So the ghost dance of 1890, the Wounded Knee Massacre. Just a show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of at least the ghost dance? Okay, oh, good. How many of you have ever heard of at least the Wounded Knee Massacre? Oh, just about everybody. Okay, good. Okay, so that fits the first criteria. The second, I wanted to choose a topic that would teach us something, that allow us to sort of open a window on the larger question of American Indian religion and what it can teach us about that topic and about American history in general. And I think this qualifies for that as well. Specifically, let me suggest at the outset that it addresses these events. They're really intertwined, the ghost dance and the massacre. It addresses three very common perceptions that we all grow up with about American Indian history. Three perceptions, common perceptions, cliches, really. And I think this topic sheds light on all three of those. They are, number one, Indian peoples, especially back in what's called the Old West, not this Old West, but the Old West generally. And that is, Indian peoples back at that time were sort of stuck in the past, frozen in the past. They were clinging to these ancient traditions, and they were sort of stuck there, and these traditions were inevitably doomed in this modern world, especially as they were increasingly invaded by large numbers of people with this very dynamic society and cultures. Number one. Number two, Indian-white relations were defined almost exclusively by conflict, fighting, right? That's the story. That's the big story. And when you bring those two together, you get the third cliche. And that is, once these outmoded, static ways of life came into conflict with this new dynamic society, Indians were destined to lose and essentially to end. Their whole history would end. This is the cliche of the vanishing American, the vanished America. Indian people, if not physically, at least their whole way of life is over. It really came to a conclusion about the end of the 19th century, the time that I'll be talking about today. Well, all three of us, I think you're probably familiar with. That's part of this impression that so many of us grow up with. Well, as is true of most cliches, there is some truth to each of these. But it's also the fact that they are grossly distorted, and they conceal far more than they reveal. So, for example, the Indian people were stuck in the past. They were frozen in this past of this clinging to this outmoded, static way of life and customs. Well, they certainly, if you stress the ancient, that's true compared to us. Indian peoples have been here a long time compared to us in this room, unless there are native peoples here in the room today. Historians argue about just when their ancestors first arrived here. Historians, of course, argue about everything. Was it hot today? No, it wasn't hot today. It was hot. But we can say safely that virtually all would agree that they have been here at least 13,000 years. It's a long time compared to us. Here's one way to illustrate this. I use this in class. Stretch your arm out with your index finger extended. Come on, you can do it. Okay, right? Okay, this is a timeline. Here is when American history begins. History is a story of what people have done over time. So American history starts when people show up. 13,000 years ago. Let's use that. This is the present, right? So look down this timeline and ask yourself, where is Columbus? Where's Columbus? Columbus is right here. Here. All of that is American history before Columbus. So, yeah, ancient traditions, you bet. They go back quite a ways. But static, unchanging, sort of incapable of adjusting? No. No, that is absolutely wrong. And I'll try to emphasize that this evening. Second cliche, conflict. Conflict. Yeah, there's a lot of conflict, a lot of bloodshed. But from the very first moment, the first hour of contact between Indians and invaders, between natives and newcomers, there was also exchange. Each of these two cultures influencing the other, borrowing from each other. It was this dynamic sort of cross-pollinization that was going on from the very beginning and continues today. Certainly it was true at the time that I'll be talking about this evening. Third, the vanishing American. Well, again, there is some truth to that. Once again, historians and anthropologists argue, often pretty loudly, about the population of native peoples in what's today the United States at the time of the first European contact. How many Indians were here? Very hard, of course, to estimate that. But a good, in my opinion at least, a good, fairly safe estimate in the U.S., in southern Canada, is about 5 to 6 million. 5 to 6 million people. Okay, now move forward to the time I'll be talking about tonight, the end of the 19th century. What was the population then? We have, of course, a much firmer grasp of that number. And it's right at 250,000, 250,000. So native population declined by about 90 to 95% over that period. But, first of all, and that population since then began to grow, expanded considerably. Today, native, that in the census, as a census category, Indian peoples are among the most rapidly increasing group that is studied in the U.S. Census. But more the point than that, in strictly numbers, native culture, ways of life, traditions, religions have also continued, survived, and are vital today, as they have been all along. So all three of those cliches have something going for them. All three are mischievously incorrect. And until we correct that, we will not understand the native story, and therefore we will not understand American history. So, as I said, I think the topic tonight, that is the ghost dance and wounded knee, will help us understand, sort of open our eyes to those cliches and how we can correct them. All right, so let me do two things, basically. Let me, first of all, give you a very brief sort of thumbnail narrative of the events around the ghost dance and the massacre of 1890. Then we'll step back and look at them. Pick apart this narrative and apply specifically those three notions, those three cliches to it, and ask ourselves, what can we learn about that? Okay, so first the story. 1890, Indian peoples had been defeated militarily. All meaningful resistance had been crushed by 1890. Indian peoples had been largely dispossessed of their homelands. They had been confined to reservations, most of them in the West. You can see them on this map. You know, a tiny portion of their original homelands, which was the entire map, of course, at the beginning. These are reservations or agencies, had the job of converting, of transforming these Indian peoples into people who would then fit into the mainstream of American life. And this was to be done by, for example, by converting them to the farming economy. That's what you know, the classic American job was farming the land, working the land. By educating them in the culture of mainstream America. That meant everything from how their families were structured to how they lived, the houses they lived in, how they dressed, how they spoke, of course, especially. And finally, by conversion to Christianity. This is a very explicit purpose of reservations, conversion to Christianity, which was considered the only true civilized religion, and certainly the mainstream religion of the United States. That was the situation in 1890 when this new native religion appeared. It began in far western Nevada, along the on a reservation there, which is close to the Comstock Lode, Virginia City. Among the Paiute people, this place called the Walker River Reservation. Its prophet was this man. His Paiute name was Wovoka. His English name was Jack. Jack Wilson. He had grown up living part of his life with the family there. The Wilson family were ranchers, and he was a ranch hand. He's described as he's tall, by the terms of the day, rather handsome. He had a deep, resonant voice. He wore this distinctive hat. You almost always saw him in this hat, very broad-brimmed, with this very tall crown. At least a 10-gallon hat. I figured 15. Wovoka said that around 1887, he had fallen into a trance. And he had traveled, and he was described, laying out sort of absolutely stiff and unresponsive. And he had traveled in this trance beyond the Milky Way to heaven. And there, God instructed him with this new religion. What was it? God said, go back and tell your people several things. First, they must live by this rather strict moral code. And this is true not just of Paiutes, of all Indian peoples. This new moral teaching. They were to dance a particular dance, several new ceremonies, but above all, this new dance, a round dance, and clockwise motion, men, women, and children. No drums, just the pounding of feet on the bare earth as they chanted these songs. For hours and hours, they would dance this dance. And if they did this, if they lived by the code, and if they practiced this dance, then God would reward them. The dead would return, thus the ghost dance. The earth would be replenished and regenerated. The old ways would be revived. The good times of the past would return. In other words, this was a millennialist religion, specifically on Indian term, native terms. Well, this was this new religion. He began to preach it. He began to attract some attention. It really got some legs and some traction when he claimed he could control the weather, which is very helpful in the West. And they were suffering, sort of a modern note, contemporary note, suffering a terrible drought during these years. And so one of the skeptical Paiute leaders came to him and said, okay, hotshot, if you can control the weather, make it rain. And he said, it'll rain in 3 days. And 3 days later, this gully washer, this torrential storm went on for a couple of days. The Walker River was filled to the brim. Well, that got their attention. And this began to spread, first throughout the Great Basin, and then more widely. This is a map that shows, here's the Walker River over here. You can see, hold on. Pointer, of course, is not working. Sorry, over there to the far left, it's the Walker River Reservation. And these lines, this map shows you the spread of this religion. Now, let me say at this point, this map and others that I'll show you as we go along come from my most excellent student, Justin Gage, who, this is from his dissertation, and he then published a book, excellent book, came out last year, called We Do Not Want the Gates Closed Between Us. Justin's here tonight. Would you raise your hand, please, Justin, back there? Okay, there he is. Okay. This is just, it's an extraordinary amount of work to produce this, as you'll see. Anyhow, this shows you roughly, and look how fast this was. This was a matter of months, that this spread from far western Nevada across the west. And it attracted a special attention over there among the Sioux, the western Sioux, called Lakotas, up there in South Dakota, South and North Dakota. You can see up there. So many of those lines go there. It really got attention there. And it became a great passion among the Lakota Sioux on those reservations. In particular, the Standing Rock Reservation. This is the reservation. You might sound familiar to you. This is the site of the crisis over the pipeline a while back. The Standing Rock Reservation. It really caught on there, and hundreds of Lakota on that reservation began to practice it. They would do these dances for hours and hours, always away from, the agency itself. Well, predictably, this unnerved the white authorities. They became convinced that this was the prelude to an uprising. That they were getting into sort of, jacking themselves up to rise up against the authorities. And as their concern grew, they increasingly pressed to have troops sent to the reservation, and they got them. At the time, by late 1890, by late fall of 1890, 1/3 of the U.S. Army was on the Standing Rock Reservation. 1 out of every 3 soldiers under arms of the U.S. Army was on that reservation. Poised. Whoop, whoa, okay. Naturally enough, on the Standing Rock Reservation, their attention increasingly focused on one person, Sitting Bull, Tataki Iwatanka, who was a Hunkpapa, the Hunkpapa band of the Teton or Western Lakota Sioux. He was, of course, the most famous Indian in America. He was best known, of course, for being there at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. He had then toured with Bill Cody and became quite close friends with Cody. But he was famous. He was a celebrity of sorts, although kind of a villain celebrity at the time. And he lived on the Standing Rock Reservation. Now, we're not entirely sure how he felt about the ghost dance. He allowed it in his camp, but he apparently did not participate. Sort of wait and see attitude. But the authorities said this guy is the troublemaker. So, December 15th, 1890, McLaughlin, the agent, ordered the arrest of Sitting Bull by some Indian police. The reservation had Indian police. They went to his house, his cabin, to arrest him. He resisted, as did others around him, and in the stress, in this mention, one of his followers shot the head of the Indian police who was there, and that, of course, set off chaos. Sitting Bull was killed, shot twice in the head. Others were killed around him, and this set off a panic among the other reservations. The Sioux said, "Oh my God, what's going to come of this?" In particular, this man, Spotted Elk, also known as Bigfoot, he was the chief, the head of the Minneconjou band on the Cheyenne River Reservation. That's the lower half of that one on the top. And he led his followers, his people, out of that, running away, along with some about 48 Hunkpapa, trying to make their way down to the Pine Ridge Reservation to the south to find refuge there. As they approached that reservation, they were met by a contingent of the Army who stopped them and told them to camp at a nearby creek, Wounded Knee Creek, and to wait for instructions. During that night, this was on December 28th, during that night more troops arrived, so that by the morning there were about more than 500 troops there. The men were all ordered to come together and to disarm, to turn over whatever rifles they had. And that proceeded, and they began to lay the rifles down, and then the soldiers would go among them and take the rifles from them. And then there was a problem with one of the men. He was probably stone deaf. He didn't understand really what was going on. But in any case, he sort of resisted the soldier taking his rifle. We're not sure exactly what was happening, but a gun went off. Might have been probably that one. Somewhere, somebody shot. And with that, the troops just opened up. As you can see, they surrounded the camp as well as the men. They opened up, including, see up there on that hill, Hotchkiss batteries. These were Hotchkiss guns. There were 4 Hotchkiss guns. These were early machine guns. They had a revolving barrel that shot 68 rounds per minute, a little over one round per second. And the Hotchkiss guns opened up as well. The men, of course, most of the deaths in the first few moments were of the men. That's where the troops fired. But after that, the Hotchkiss guns and the soldiers opened up on the village where the women and children were, firing these guns into these indiscriminately. And with that, everything unraveled. The officers lost control over their men who swarmed into this village and began killing everybody. A lot of the women and children sought refuge. If you can see there's this dry ravine, it's sort of a gully, and they took refuge down there to get away from the Hotchkiss guns, and the soldiers went up to the edge of that and shot them dead in the bottom. This was followed by a brutal blizzard that came in immediately after this. So the troops went away. It was a few days before anybody came back. By that time, the bodies were frozen. There's a spotted elk before and after. The men locals were hired, paid $2 per corpse to throw these bodies into wagons. They were then taken and buried in a mass grave. It's hard to tell exactly how many people died here. The official record said about 160, but then it said probably about 200, probably more. So best estimate today is about 200 to 250 were killed. Great majority of them women and children. 25 troops were killed. Some, I'm sure, by Indians. Many by friendly fire. They're all firing. They're in this circle of firing into it and killing their own people. In any case, it was a bloodbath, slaughter, a massacre. So by the early 1891, it was over. Okay, that's the brief narrative. So what can we learn from it? We pick this apart. Look at it closely. Pick it apart. What can we learn from it? What's going on here? When I was in grad school, my mentor was a man named Robert Athern, Bob Athern, and he told me once, Elliott, he said, historians only ask one question: what's going on here? I sort of nodded thoughtfully and inside thinking, that's about the dumbest thing I've ever heard a smart man say. But here it is, more than 50 years later, he was absolutely right. That's right, absolutely right. That's all we do. We take ourselves back into the past at some moment, and then we look around, and we ask, what's going on here? What's going on? So what's going on here? What can we learn from this? Okay, looking at these three cliches, looking at the ghost dance first, and then the massacre as the aftermath. Cliche number one, Indian peoples were frozen in the past, clinging to these outmoded traditions, ancient outmoded traditions that could not survive in modern America, unable to adjust, and therefore doomed. Well, there's something to it. That vision of Avoca, after all, was invoking the return of the past, the coming back of good times, the revival of the dead. In that way it was, sort of backward looking, clinging to this older vanishing life. But it was much, much more complicated than that. First place, this was, as I said, a millennialist religion. This is not an exactly unknown concept to Americans, and specifically to Christian Americans. And in fact, if you know some religious history, you know American religious history, you know that the late 19th, early 20th century was a time when there was a special invigoration of this millennialist ideas. So some have argued, no, in fact, they were just fitting rather well into an important aspect of religious history at that time. They were fitting into American life, not rejecting it. But more specifically, this moral vision, this moral code that I've talked about, what did he say specifically? What was that code? Voca said, number one, no conflict. Do no harm. Get along with your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Kindness. Embrace your enemy. Well, first of all, it sounds awfully Christian, but this is also, let me suggest to you, this is also a very practical advice. What he was saying is, because he was talking about not just other Indians, but whites as well. What he was saying was, don't fight whites, because if you do, you'll lose. This is water, by the way. You'll lose. In other words, this is the only practical way that's going to survive. We've got to get along. We've got to get along. Furthermore, this is really interesting. Another part of this code was work hard. Work hard. The Paiutes had given up their hunting and gathering economy and had become wage workers in this industrial mining economy around Virginia City. They were like factory workers in in Pennsylvania or someplace. What he was saying was, don't stick with the system. Work in the system. Work hard. Make as much progress as you can. Get along. Get along. All the time, of course, hoping, anticipating this second coming, in effect. So this is very practical advice that he was coming up with. Far from sort of advocating this rigid code, this rigid tradition way of life that can't fit in, he was fitting in. He was doing what he could, to help these people assimilate, to survive in America of this time, of 1890. Second, conflict. Well, yeah, Wounded Knee is about as vivid an example as I can think of a brutal and bloody confrontation in the 19th century. It's a nasty, nasty event. Yeah, but exchange. Think of how this religion and the spread of the religion in particular reflects the ability of Indians, the ability of the Indians to borrow from whites for what they needed. First of all, I mentioned before, there are many, many Christian concepts that they're using here. Love your neighbor, be kind, no conflict, do no harm. Whenever I read these words of Voca, I think of our blessings at the end of our service. My favorite one: go forth into the world in peace, render no person evil for evil. That's really very much what he was saying. So he's borrowing these Christian traditions, including the idea of this millennialist idea of religious time as a linear movement. The European sense of time, the Christian religion is linear. It's a line. It goes from past to present to future. It ends with the end time. This is the traditional way that Indians thought about the passage of time. It's a spiral. It has no beginning, no end. It just goes on forever. Well, the Coastants had adopted this millennialist concept, this idea of a linear religion. So he's again borrowing that aspect. But what's especially fascinating is how, in the spread of this movement, these Indians were adopting white ways, white means. Going back to this slide, remember I said that the gold standard spread very, very rapidly, very rapidly. How? How could that happen? How could that happen? How could people in South Dakota learn what's going on at the Walker River? Well, and this is again Justin's work. Turns out the idea that we have of these people on reservations being sort of shut up in cages, isolated from one another, is absolutely wrong. From the very beginning of the reservations, there was this extraordinary efforts of visiting and movement among them. This, again, is one of Justin's maps. This shows the visitations that he discovered among these reservations, those lines. And the thicker the line, the larger the groups. So in some cases, we're seeing, more than 100 persons going from one reservation to another to visit there. How did they go? Well, short distances, they went by horse. So much of this was by train. They bought tickets and traveled around the West. I mean, to me, that looks like one of these, time exposure photographs of flights in today. That's a lot of movement, right? And what happens when they do that? They begin to share ideas, to compare notes, to talk to each other. Ancient enemies became allies. The Pawnees of Nebraska and the Lakotas, those guys up in the Dakotas, had been brutal, had been vicious enemies for as long as anyone could remember. Now they formed an alliance. They began to practice similar, come up with new liturgies, new ideas. So what you see here in this visitation, excuse me, is the beginnings of a sense of common identity. I might need some more water. Someone give me some. And just to state the obvious, what they're doing here, of course, is borrowing from the very technologies of the people who have conquered them to put them to their own devices. So, put those together, how did it spread? Well, it's obvious. Compare those lines of movement. It spread by train, essentially. Especially fascinating part of this has to do with, of all things, boarding schools. We're all familiar with these, off-reservation boarding schools. Thank you, sir. We all know this. This is Carlisle, the most famous of them in Pennsylvania. These were schools in which Indian young people were taken and confined, and they were to be transformed into model citizens. That was the purpose. That was the purpose of this. There were 27 of them across the country. And the process supposedly was illustrated by this. They go in that way and they come out that way. Richard Henry Pratt was the one who established the first of the Carlisle. Pratt famously said, in Indian policy, I am a Baptist. What do you mean by that? He didn't mean the denomination. He was saying, in these schools, these young people will be totally immersed in this new way of life and reborn, like our baptism. So, in other words, they were to be, how did that mean? They were forbidden to speak their language. They were required to dress in that way. They were taught to work in certain occupations. Again, remade over. So, the idea here was, they were to be dunked into a reservation school, and when they're pulled out, they joined the Rotary Club or something. So this transformation. But what happened? Well, to an extent that happened. It's a complicated story, but one of the things that happened, and Pratt's very famous statement was, what we need to do is kill the Indian to save the man. Do away from native tradition and culture to save them in modern America. Well, what happened? What happened when these young folks from from the Pacific Northwest and the Great Plains and the Southwest and Texas and Montana, were all put in the same place, they looked around at each other and said, oh, we all have the same problems, right? We're facing the same kind of challenges. We have far more in common than we knew. The irony here is, when Pratt said the idea was to kill the Indian, there was no Indian. Indian, that is, a sense of common purpose. Identity was tribal, clan, band, and often, of course, at odds with each other. So there was no Indian to kill. But as they came to know each other, they began to recognize that there was this Indianness, there was this common identity. So, in effect, what these schools did was not kill the Indian, they created the Indian. And that's this one just delicious irony. And furthermore, crucial to this, of course, as I said, was giving up old languages and learning English. Learning English. Well, that gave them, as they went back, a lingua franca among all tribes. It was a common language that they had now to express this common identity. They learned to read and write. With that, once again, they were able to communicate with each other, just as they were visiting and moving across, communicate each other by correspondence. This is what sort of the guts of Justin's book is looking at thousands of these letters sent, including spreading the word of the ghost dance. This map shows the correspondence among reservations through the post office, spreading the word of the ghost dance. So, looking at those three cliches, you can see that all of them have some element of truth to them, but all of them, in a larger sense, are dead wrong. Dead wrong. What this episode shows is these people are adaptive. They're not frozen in the past, they're adaptive. It shows that it's a story of exchange. And the final cliche, did they disappear? Specifically, did their way of life disappear? No. No. It was, of course, deeply challenging. I should say, up until the 1930s, up until the New Deal, the government's official, stated, on-the-table policy remained the destruction of Indian cultures. They're very clear. Historians, again, argue about the term genocide. Was this genocide? Well, that is the relations. Yes and no. But cultural genocide, absolutely. Absolutely. That was our policy until the 1930s. Did it work? No. No, it didn't. In terms of survival, what you see is this ongoing, up until today, this ongoing story of adaptation of tradition to contemporary life. In some ways, using religion as a lens to study, to look at this. Obvious example is the Native American Church. This is a recognized religious denomination. It, again, is shot through with Christian principles as well. It began at the same time that we looked at in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was then called the peyote religion. It evolved. It also had this moral code very similar to Avoca's. It evolved into the Native American Church, which is recognized today. But far more often, far more commonly, what you see is Indian peoples working within traditional Christian denominations to give it their own twist, their own meanings. Here are a couple of examples. This is a painting from the Hopi people of Arizona. It depicts what's called a Soyal ceremony. This is a ceremony at the winter solstice. At this time, these Kachinas, these men are these Kachina dancers are representing Kachina spirits that live from below the earth. And during the winter solstice, they come up to the Sipapu, see this opening into our world, and they remain They remain among us for 6 months until the summer solstice, when they return to their below the earth. And this is a ceremony in which they are greeted and recognized. Those guys over to the left, with the horns on their head, those are called sacred clowns. Sacred clowns. They're like court jesters in European tradition. Their job is to mock the spirits. Well, the Pueblos today, the 17 Pueblos today, are overwhelmingly Roman Catholic in their religion. And many of them still are, and most of them originally were named after Catholic saints. This includes Santo Domingo Pueblo. It's now called the Kiwa, but it's dedicated to St. Dominic. On his feast day, August the 4th, they hold great ceremonies honoring St. Dominic. This is one of those ceremonies. It's a Roman Catholic ceremony honoring St. Dominic, and it has sacred clowns. So what you see here, again, is this sort of a hybrid, or if you want a really expensive word, a syncretic religion that develops out of this. And this is, you find these examples all over America, all over America. The last slide I want to show you brings us closer to home. It's a very brief YouTube video. It is of the Cherokee Baptist Choir, just over the line into Oklahoma. And this particular moment is from even closer to home, up in Bentonville, at the Native American Museum there. If I can make it go. Grace in Cherokee. So what's going on here? What I'm hoping to show this evening is by looking at this one part of Native American religious history at this critical moment, we can get a better understanding, fuller understanding of larger themes of Native American life and history, specifically focusing on those 3 points. Native American history for more than 400 years now, the first arrival of Europeans, has been this story of adaptation. Adaptation has been this story of this continuing tension, interplay, dance between these two poles, tradition and adaptation, conflict and adjustment, borrowing, exchange, tragedy and survival, resilience. That, for the 40 years of teaching this, to me, that is the essence of Native American history. We see it here specifically in religion, but you can find it in all aspects of life. That is the Native American story. And that is it's a great American story. A great American story. It's part of American history more broadly. And that means, of course, that we cannot possibly understand our common story as Americans without bringing those sorts of insights into it, without integrating that story into it. Until we do that, we will not really begin to understand American history at large. And if we don't understand American history, we will never know who we are and how we've come to be who we are. All right, that's all I got. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming. Got a few minutes.
We can entertain a few questions. Let me ask you, if you want to ask a question, don't go like this. Go like this because we have people at home watching this, and if you have the microphone down. So go ahead when you're answering your question, speak right into the microphone. Rebecca, go ahead.
When they were going back and forth between the reservations, they didn't all speak the same language, did they?
They what?
They didn't all have
Didn't
the
speak
same
Well,
language.
they learned. You know, they came up with, again, English. Increasingly, English was
Well,
common. It was
but
common
prior to
language.
that, when they would get to another reservation on the
Look,
train or the horse, how
right.
could they talk to each other?
That's a great idea. Google Translate.
I don't think so.
No, well, first of all, keep in mind, that's an excellent point. Keep in mind, different Indian groups with different languages have been visiting each other, working with each other forever. You know, this interplay among them had been there forever. So they had systems of doing it. Sign language is the most obvious, but they had ways, and there were typically people who were bilingual who could do that. But increasingly, English became the means of doing that. One of the things that Justice studies in his book is the rates of literacy on these reservations, and it rises steadily. Yeah.
My name is John Borbas. I come from Hungary. And in traveling to this country, I'm seeing Indian reservation. Indian reservation always part of the country is desert or not fertile land. But sometimes they luck out, maybe have found oil, like in Palm Springs they have found other stuff. But Americans would have learned from the Indians. They have great knowledge of stuff.
How many what now, Yvonne?
Indians have good history. They have medicine and other stuff.
Sure.
Why don't we learn from it?
What do we learn from them? Oh,
Why don't
very
you
much,
learn?
very much. If you study sort of the nature of medicines, there's a long list of medicines we have today that can trace their origins back to that. Language, of course, American English is shot through with words as well. So this exchange went both ways, certainly. Yeah.
But why America have against the Indians so much hatred or indifference? They took
Why?
why?
Well, that's thanks for the easy question. It's to put it most bluntly, they had what we wanted. And I teach a course called The West of the Imagination, which deals with this topic as well. It was necessary, at certain times for us to have this sort of villain in order to conquer, to control, to justify what we were doing. We had to see them as the bad guys, to do it. Those are the very, very simple answers to it. Yeah.
Professor West, thank you for coming to us today. I have read that Union generals William Tecumseh Sherman and Philip Sheridan were primary military leaders America, who were involved in the ethnic cleansing of the Prairie Indians. Could you comment on that?
William Sherman and Phil Sheridan.
Sherman and Philip Sheridan
Yeah.
were
Well,
ethnic cleansing of the Prairie Indians.
right. Depends on how you use the term. As I said before, there's a great debate going on right now among American historians. How you describe American policy. Some say it was genocidal. Others say it was ethnic cleansing, which is much closer, in my opinion, to the truth. Now, I think to clarify that, they tried to do that. It's included, of course, cultural genocide. If you mean by ethnic cleansing the destruction of them, that was not Sheridan's or Sherman's policy. Their policy was you hit them like hell if they resist. Same philosophy that Sherman had in the Civil War, of course. Well, you end this horrible event. War is hell, he said. The way you end war is you just kick the bejabbers out of your enemy. And that was his policy toward the Indians as well. With that, leave them alone. Cage them up. Put them there and turn them into Americans.
He did ethnic cleansing from the prairies to an extent.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Back to John Duvall.
Thanks, Elliott. I read a book by you, and did I did I get this wrong? But weren't two of the leading officers in that slaughter at Wounded Knee, didn't they refuse the orders to participate in the slaughter? And didn't one of them write back and demand a court-martial? Or was that, am I confusing that with something else?
You're confusing it with the Sand Creek Massacre.
Oh, okay,
November
it was a
of
different
18-
massacre.
1864.
Oh,
Yes,
well, I
that was
hate
another-
that.
yeah,
There's
that was-
another one. Oh,
that was
okay.
one more, yeah. It was a,
Yeah, okay.
It was another absolutely appalling, even, in many ways, even more shocking than this one. But you're right. At that massacre, led by John Shivington on this peace band, this peace village of Cheyennes and Arapahoes, there were two officers who refused to take part and ordered their men not to take part. After that, they took part. There were 3 trials of Shivington. He lost all 3 of them. He was condemned, and this was officially defined as an atrocity by the government. And these two, one of these officers in particular, my name is Simon Soule, testified at that. And for that effort, he was murdered. He was shot dead in a Denver alley. Yeah. So you're thinking of that. I think the larger point is, if you look at this sordid history of these conflicts, what's surprising sometimes, I found this in my own work, what's surprising sometimes is some of the most sympathetic voices are among the officers who, they're good soldiers, they're carrying out their orders, but they say, this is bullshit, excuse me. This is crazy. This is crazy what we're doing. And these two young men were examples of that, yeah.
Yeah, I have 2 questions. The first one is, have you read the new report on the Indian schools that came out in Congress?
I have not, although I heard, this was on the radio just a day or 2 ago, yeah. I heard the report. I have not read the report.
Okay, because they had said there was a lot of atrocities that occur in the schools.
Yep.
And also, I think it's interesting because if somebody came in here and told us all to drop Christ and drop all our traditions and to change it because it was out of date and we need to get modern, I don't think we'd be real happy with that.
No, we wouldn't. Yeah, there is this way in which that strikes I think, me and most people, is breathtakingly naive.
So you don't think that the U.S. government was oppressive with the Indian culture?
Oh, it was absolutely oppressive. No, I'm saying it was cultural genocide, what I said. Yes, they were doing everything they could. Outlawing all of these religions, outlawing dances, outlawing how they dressed. Absolutely. They failed, but that was their purpose. We can look back on that as not, for reasons you said, is it naive, not just naive, but incredibly ignorant of how human cultures work. They just thought they could, flip a switch. Doesn't work that way. Doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I visited Pine Ridge last summer,
Uh-huh.
and I was surprised to find that one of the primary Christian churches present on the reservation was the Episcopal Church.
Yep.
Yeah, so I wondered if you might say something about how they
Well,
got
this
there.
goes, this goes.
And what they're doing now, because
Yeah,
I got some...
this goes back to the Indian policy under U.S. Grant, right after the Civil War. And what Grant did was, it was called the peace policy, or sometimes the Quaker policy. But Grant said that we will turn over agencies specifically to Christian denominations. Right, so the Presbyterians, you get the Nez Perce. And these, they even gave one to the Unitarians, for Pete's sake. But we got the Lakotas. We got the Western Sioux. And this continues, to the extent that the Christian churches are well established. They're more often than not Episcopal. At one time, there was a Lakota bishop. And if you look, again, there was a Bishop Whipple earlier who was a great advocate of the Indians at the time, and he was an Episcopal bishop who had worked with the Lakota. So yeah, they were the ones that we got.
What happened to the originator of the ghost dance, Jack?
Jack Wilson. What had happened to him?
Yeah.
Well, he survived, of course. Obviously, he was not involved and another thing that I think that's interesting, the ghost dance didn't vanish with Wounded Knee. The ghost dance, the religion was practiced up until the 1920s, when it gradually went away. At the same time, the peyote religion grew and evolved into the Native American church today. But he was, of course, something of a celebrity, interviewed a lot. He was a bit of a showman, and he seemed to enjoy all of this. But of course, this became inextricably connected. The ghost dance became so connected with Wounded Knee that it was it sort of changed the whole direction of the movie, of the movement.
Thank you for your talk. Could you tell us a little bit about the ghost dance shirts?
The ghost shirts?
Mm-hmm.
This is a tradition. There were these sort of sacred shirts that some of the dancers were to wear. There's a lot of debate about what they meant. What you often hear is that these shirts were meant to, they were told that these would repel bullets. And as long as you wore the ghost shirts, that the firearms would not. And this, of course, was used as sort of a, evidence A by the military and others who said this is a military effort. They're doing this, because they're about to rise up against us. Historians and anthropologists are not real sure how critical that part of the ghost shirt, the idea of the ghost shirts, was. This goes back to, as I said, Wovoka was something of a showman. And at the time that he was establishing this, he would try to show miracles. And one of them was he stood up and somebody shot a shotgun at his chest, and the pellets fell on the ground. Well, this almost certainly a trick. It turned out the shotgun was full of sand, and somehow he triggered something, and all these pellets fell on the ground. So it may have somehow been connected with that. But anyway, we're not entirely sure how prominent these shirts were and what the message around them was to be. You know anything about that, Justin? What's that? Only among the ghost shirts were only among Lakotas.
And only a few of those folks.
And only what?
A few of them. So
Only a few of them, okay. So it wasn't that.
some Lakota.
Let's say thank you to Elliott for being with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elliott, and thank you also to those members of the Tippy Committee and other volunteers who helped provide our reception this evening. A big thanks to them. Hope to see y'all at our next Tippy event this fall. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Bravo. Bravo. Perfect.
Wonderful.